The autumn wind rustled through the trees, sending a cascade of golden leaves tumbling onto the cracked sidewalk. In the quiet suburbs of Willowbrook, a boy named Jake Reynolds tightened his grip on the worn wooden handle of his rake. At just 14, he wasn't the kind of kid who spent his weekends playing video games or hanging out at the mall like most of his classmates. Instead, he did odd jobs around the neighborhood, mowing lawns, shoveling snow, and in the fall, raking leaves. It wasn't just about making a few extra bucks. His mum, a single parent working 2 jobs, had taught him the value of hard work. And deep down, Jake liked the idea of doing something useful. That afternoon, Jake had taken on a new yard, the biggest one yet. It belonged to an old woman named Mrs. Waverly, someone he had seen before, but never really spoken to. She lived alone in the largest house on the block, a towering Victorian-style home that had once been grand, but now looked worn by time. Most kids in the neighborhood avoided it. There were rumors, the kind kids whispered about at bus stops, that Mrs. Waverly was a witch, that she had hidden treasures in her house, that she never left because she was hiding something. But Jake didn't believe in stories. He believed in hard work, and Mrs. Waverly had offered to pay him well. The moment he stepped onto her front porch, he hesitated. The place felt different, not scary, just quiet, too quiet. The heavy wooden door creaked open before he even knocked, and there she was. Mrs. Waverly was nothing like the stories. She wasn't hunched over a cauldron or glaring at him with beady eyes. She was just old, fragile. Her silver hair was pinned up neatly, and she wore a faded blue sweater. Her bony hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You must be Jake," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're the boy who rakes the leaves." Jake nodded, shifting uncomfortably under her gaze. "Yes, Mom." She smiled faintly and stepped aside, motioning for him to follow. "Come in for a moment before you start. It's chilly out." He hesitated. He hadn't expected an invitation inside, but something about her, maybe the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, or how her voice carried a quiet kindness, made him step forward. The house smelled of cinnamon and old books. The furniture was antique, the kind you'd see in a museum, but everything was well kept. There were pictures on the walls, black and white photographs of people who must have been her family. "I appreciate you doing this, Jake," she said, settling into a chair. "I can't manage the yard like I used to." He shrugged. "It's no problem. I like helping out." For the next hour, Jake worked. The yard was enormous, and the leaves were piled high, but he didn't mind. Every now and then, he caught Mrs. Waverly watching him from the window, her expression unreadable. When he was done, he knocked on the door to let her know. She handed him a warm cup of cider and a crisp $20 bill. "Come back next week," she said simply. The leaves never stopped falling, and so he did. Week after week, Jake returned, and each time, Mrs. Waverly was there. Sometimes she'd watch him from the porch, sometimes she'd sit inside with her tea, and sometimes, on the colder afternoons, she'd invite him in for cider and a short conversation. At first, their talks were small. She'd ask about school, about his mum, about his plans for the future. But over time, she started sharing stories of her own. She had once been a school teacher, she told him, back when the world felt different. Her husband had died many years ago, and they'd never had children. She had spent most of her life alone in that big house, watching the world change outside her window. Jake found himself listening, really listening. It wasn't like talking to his friends, or even his teachers. There was something different about Mrs. Waverly, something wise, something lonely. The weeks turned into months. and soon the trees were bare. The work was done, but Jake still visited. He didn't need the money anymore. He just liked spending time with her. They played chess, talked about books, and sometimes just sat in comfortable silence. Then, one day, it happened. Jake knocked on the door, just like always. But this time, no one answered. He tried again. Nothing. The house felt colder, emptier. His stomach twisted as he peered through the window. The living room light was on, but Mrs. Waverley wasn't there. That was when he saw it. The note taped to the door. His hands shook as he pulled it free. It was from her lawyer. Mrs. Waverley had passed away in her sleep. Jake stood there, frozen. He had seen her just days ago. She had been fine. She had laughed at one of his terrible jokes, scolded him for forgetting his gloves in the cold. And now, she was gone. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt small, helpless. He swallowed the lump in his throat and turned to leave. But then, something caught his eye. A second envelope tucked just beneath the first. It had his name on it. His heart pounded as he tore it open. The letter inside was short, simple. Jake, thank you for your kindness. You reminded me that I wasn't alone. You are a good boy, and I hope you never change. There is something I want you to have. My lawyer will explain everything. With love, Margaret Waverley. Jake's hands trembled. What did she mean? What was she leaving him? He had no idea that the next time he walked into that house, his entire life would change forever. Jake sat on his bed, staring at the letter. His fingers traced over Mrs. Waverley's name, as if somehow, touching the ink would bring her back. He still couldn't believe she was gone. Just days ago, she had been sitting in her usual chair, wrapped in her favorite blue sweater, talking about the books she loved. And now, the house was empty. But what did she mean in the letter? What was it that she wanted him to have? The next morning, Jake's mom drove him to the law office. Listed on the envelope, the building was old, with tall windows and a sign that read, Harrison & Coda Legal Services. Jake's palms were sweaty as they walked inside. A man in a dark suit greeted them. You must be Jake. His voice was calm, professional. I'm Mr. Harrison. Please have a seat. Jake sat down, his heart pounding. The lawyer opened a file, flipping through a few papers. Before looking up, Mrs. Waverley left you something in her will. Jake swallowed hard. What did she leave me? Mr. Harrison smiled faintly. Her house. Jake blinked. What? She left you her house. The lawyer repeated. Along with everything inside. His mom gasped beside him. There must be some mistake. He's just a kid. Mr. Harrison shook his head. No mistake. Mrs. Waverley was very clear. She wanted Jake to have it. Jake felt like the world had tilted sideways. The biggest house in the neighborhood. His? It didn't make sense. Why him? The lawyer continued. There's more. Mrs. Waverley had a substantial estate. She was a millionaire. Jake's breath caught in his throat. A millionaire. That didn't seem possible. She had always lived so simply. Her house was old, her clothes plain, her furniture worn. There was never any sign of wealth. His mom shook her head in disbelief. How is that possible? She never seemed rich. Mr. Harrison nodded. She was very private about her finances. But she had investments, properties, and savings that added up over the years. He turned to Jake. She trusted you, Jake. She saw something in you. Jake didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure how to feel. He had only wanted to help her. He never expected anything in return. And now he had inherited something far bigger than he could understand. A week later, Jake stood in front of the house again. Only this time it felt different. Before, it had been her house. Now it was his. But it didn't feel like it. It still smelled like cinnamon and old books, and her chair was still by the fireplace, as if she might walk in at any moment. The first few days were strange. He walked through the rooms, running his fingers over the wooden banisters, flipping through the old books on the shelves. There were things he had never noticed before. Paintings on the walls, delicate china in a glass cabinet, a dusty grand piano in the corner of the sitting room. Every corner of the house felt like a memory of someone else's life. And then he found the locked door. It was in the hallway on the second floor, a room he had never been in before. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Searching the house, he finally found the key tucked inside one of the drawers in the study. His hands shook as he fitted into the lock and turned. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside there were stacks of boxes, neatly labeled in Mrs. Waverley's handwriting. Letters, documents, photographs. Jake stepped inside cautiously. This was different from the rest of the house. Everything here felt hidden, secret. He opened the first box and pulled out a stack of yellowed papers. They were letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. And as he read the first one, his heart pounded harder. The letter was addressed to Margaret Waverley. But the signature at the bottom, it wasn't from her husband. Jake's eyes widened. These were love letters. From someone else. Someone Mrs. Waverley had never talked about. He read through another and another. The words were full of longing, of regret, of something unfinished. The letters stretched over years, decades, and then finally he found the one that made his breath catch. Margaret, I love you. I always have. But I cannot leave my family. I hope you can forgive me. I hope one day you will understand. Jake's stomach turned. Mrs. Waverley had loved someone she could never have. Why had she kept these? Why had she never told anyone? And then, buried beneath the letters, he found something else. A photo. It was old, faded, but he could still make out the faces. Mrs. Waverley, young and beautiful, standing beside a man with dark hair and striking blue eyes. A man who looked familiar. Jake's fingers tightened around the picture. He had seen those eyes before, in the mirror. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. Could it be? Was it possible? Was Mrs. Waverley more than just a kind old woman who had left him a house? Was she family? Jake's hands shook as he held the old photograph. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The man standing beside Mrs. Waverley, his sharp blue eyes, his strong jawline, looked eerily similar to Jake himself. It wasn't just a vague resemblance. It was undeniable. His heart pounded as he flipped the photo over. There was something, written in faded ink. Summer, 1962. Margaret and Henry. Henry. Jake swallowed hard. That was his grandfather's name. He barely noticed his fingers trembling as he dug deeper into the boxes, pulling out more photographs, more letters. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer they revealed. Mrs. Waverley hadn't just been a kind neighbour. She had been more than that. She had been family. Jake sat there for what felt like hours, reading letter after letter. The story they told was one he had never known, a secret buried long before he was born. Mrs. Waverley had loved Henry Reynolds, but their love had been impossible. Henry had been married, he had a family, and he had chosen to stay with them. But that didn't mean he had stopped loving her. Jake's chest tightened as he realized what this meant. Mrs. Waverley had spent her life alone, holding on to memories of a love that had never faded. And yet, she had never been bitter, never angry. Instead, she had been kind. She had taken Jake in, shared her stories, and left him the home that had once been filled with her love and heartbreak. Tears pricked his eyes. He had called her a friend, but she had seen him as something more, her grandson. The weight of it all settled deep inside him. He had spent months sitting by her fireplace, listening to her stories, never knowing that the woman who had cared for him so deeply was connected to him by something even stronger than kindness. And now, she was gone. Jake wiped his face and carefully placed the letters back into the box. He wasn't sure what to do next. He had a house that didn't feel like his, money he never expected, and a truth that had changed everything. But as he stood up, looking around the quiet, empty home, he realized something. It wasn't empty. Mrs. Waverly was still here, in every book on the shelf, in every faded photograph, in every warm cup of cider she had made for him, and she had left him more than just a house or money. She had left him a story, one that deserved to be remembered. Jake took a deep breath and walked to the front door. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling through the trees. Leaves tumbled across the yard, covering the grass in shades of gold and red. He smiled to himself. There was work to do. And this time, he wasn't just raking leaves. He was carrying on a legacy